The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization with the goal of encouraging informed and active participation of citizens in government. We envision a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. When many people think of the League, they think of services such as voter registration and civics education, which is one hat that the League wears. But our other hat is advocacy. We advocate for public policy on topics such as election, voting, economic justice, the environment, as well as many others, including election security. A free and fair democracy is at the backbone of the League's mission, and therefore election security is an important issue for us, as it should be for all Americans. The integrity of our election system is not a partisan issue. It's truly the heart of the strength of our democracy. It seems like not a single day goes by that there isn't a major news story about worries of election interference, voting machines, and how our country is going to protect election infrastructure. Many of these news reports focus on national concerns and on other states, and we don't hear much about Washington. Tonight we'll be covering quite a few topics relevant to election security. First, our featured speaker, Professor Matt Bishop, will give us an overview of many of the cybersecurity concerns surrounding elections. Then we'll discuss end-to-end verifiable elections. And finally, we'll delve into greater detail about Washington State specifically with our panelists. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Barbara Endicott-Popovsky. Barbara is the Executive Director of the UW Center for Information Assurance and Cybersecurity. She is a member of several national committees shaping cybersecurity education and has authored more than 100 peer-reviewed articles. She just recently testified in the U.S. Senate in a hearing examining cybersecurity in our nation's critical energy infrastructure. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you for coming out this evening to share conversations about my favorite topic. I've worn out family members. So having you here listening avidly to what we have to say is indeed a pleasure. The Center for Information Assurance and Cybersecurity has been here at the University of Washington since 2004. These centers began in the late 1990s. You probably haven't heard about the movement, but the initial 7 centers, 5 of them in DC, no surprise there, but 2 actually in Idaho because of INL, were the beginning of now up to over 200 universities and colleges that are adhering to NSA, DHS, NIST standards for cybersecurity education. And I've been involved here at the University of Washington since the inception of SCIAC in 2004. So for those of you that are policy wonks, anybody heard of Richard Clark? Okay. Richard Clark, and you may have heard of PDD 63, Clinton's famous directive that recognized for the first time that we have a national infrastructure problem with our infrastructure being connected online. So any of you that watched the Richard Clark series on PBS, you probably stayed up at night worrying, right? Well, I hate to break it to you. Ted Koppel came out with a book a couple years ago on the same subject, and not much has changed. So, enough said. But we certainly have made strides with developing educational standards. And initially, we invited Matt Bishop out to talk to our CSS faculty because he's leading, co-hosting, the development of academic standards in cybersecurity education. It should come as no surprise to you if you ask the NSA or DHS to write educational standards. They're going to look like training manuals. Does this surprise you? So educators, academics, need to have some different slant on these standards in order to be able to incorporate them and have them remain flexible over time, because the field is certainly changing. And so my good friend and colleague Matt Bishop, along with Diana Burley, co-chaired the task force that the ACM is putting together to develop international educational standards for cybersecurity, and I'm so happy. Could you imagine the Chinese wanting to sit down with the NSA to talk about agreed-to standards of anything? I don't think it's going to happen. So having an international professional body, a third party, independent politically party to sit down and begin to develop those standards is essential if we want to have understanding develop internationally about what we've done to ourselves by becoming so dependent on things digital. And we're going through digital transformation. So having Matt here was a delight from a technical perspective and as a colleague. But then he became a rock star. Matt has done work with voting machines and their vulnerabilities, and he has done some interesting work in California, which he will share with you. And so all of a sudden, he went viral. I told him I'm going to charge for his autographs. You know? Matt is an icon in the cybersecurity community. One of the very first. He has a great provenance. His mom, his academic mom, is Dorothy Denning, if any of you know the name. She was his major professor. And Matt had a stint, he did some time in industry, but he had a stint at Dartmouth. And he's mostly been at UC Davis, working with some very dear colleagues of mine, one of whom is Deb Frinke, who came to UC Davis after Matt arrived. And Deb is now the head of research for the NSA. She was my major professor. So we were trying to figure out what my relationship is to Matt. I think, I was going to say he's like my granddad, but I don't think, my academic granddad. But I think there's some kind of, it's like, yeah, we couldn't figure it out. But it is with great pleasure that we have Matt with us. And I can't say enough about his knowledge, how respected he is in our community. The cybersecurity community is still a very small community. We don't have the talent devoted to the problem that we really need to make a difference. I mean, we just have a lack of folks. And so those of us who are in the field know each other pretty well, and we have trusted relationships that have been built over time. So this is a profoundly wonderful colleague to be working with. I also like his image. We always know that Matt is going to represent the state of Hawaii. This is his signature. And so we have had opportunities to work together on committees. We've been in and out of conferences over the years. But he's up here also to explore other ways of collaborating that I'm pretty excited about, but it's too soon to really discuss. We're at the very beginnings. So you are getting exposed to the very best, an icon of cybersecurity, one of the founders of the field, and somebody who is well known for his publications. He has many of them. He also is the author of the textbook in cybersecurity that many here, if you're a professor, may have used in your classes. I use it in mine. And he tells me and promises me that there's a second edition coming, right, Matt?
Yes.
And when did they say that they're... They
didn't.
They didn't. They're holding his firstborn hostage.
They can have him.
So without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Matt, who's going to talk to you about elections, vulnerabilities, and the work that he's done. I hope you find this informative. As voters and as activists in this area, I want you to pay close attention because you're going to learn some practical things that you need to know. And Matt can give this lecture to your grandmother, to your kids, or to the deepest techie you ever want to meet. So this is going to be very informative. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Barbara. You're very kind. I got involved in voting work by accident. it's a good example of be very
Hold the mic
careful.
up a little closer.
I got in voting with voting work by accident. It's a very good example of be very careful what you agree to, because it tends to grow beyond what you expect. I did some work for our local election official who I got to know through work on real estate recording over the internet, which is a separate story. And that led to some adventures that I'll get to in a couple of minutes. But about this talk, what I want to do is give people a bit of background, because the way you look at security always involves what are the requirements, what you need. So I'm going to go into that a little bit and then point out a couple of key questions and then give a little bit of a history. Please be aware that the history will be slightly biased because I'm giving it from my point of view and things that I've been involved with. Then I'm going to talk about the standards, because these are what voting machines are certified against. Now they're changing rapidly, a new version is coming out, but I'll go through some of the issues with the current ones, and then talk a little bit about voting over the internet and give some concluding thoughts. Anyway, here are the election requirements, and this is not exhaustive. There are two key ones. Actually there are a couple of key ones. The privacy one is critical. And what's unusual about voting is it's a very different standard of privacy than, for example, a bank uses. With a bank, the privacy is, well, how you did the transaction should not leak out. But if you want to tell someone how you did the transaction, that's fine. With voting, the standard is how you voted. When you cast your ballot, no one should be able to determine how you vote. But also, you should not be able to prove how you vote. And the reason for this is to avoid either being paid to vote a certain way or being threatened and coerced to vote a certain way. And that difference and that standard is very difficult to meet. The other two that I did want to point out here are the transparency. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail later on, but transparency basically means that people should understand how votes are counted, how votes are cast, and be able to follow the process. One of the questions is, when you say transparency, what level of transparency do you mean? And then the other one is manageability, because very often poll workers who deal with machines are somewhat elderly, and often they don't know much about how to handle computers, and yet we have computers that people vote on. So that leads to all sorts of interesting issues. But let me kill the banking shibboleth first. One of the more common things you hear is, well, we do banking over the internet. Why can't we vote over the internet? Well, here's an ATM, and here's an electronic voting system. And the problem is with the ATM, you get the receipt. So if there's something wrong, you can walk into the bank and say, hey, look, here's the receipt from the ATM. I'm not a lawyer. I have no idea if that's dispositive, but it's at least evidence that you got out the money. But with the voting machine, there is no record of how you vote that can be tied to you, or at least there should not be. And so even though there's a paper trail there, there's nothing to associate it with you. And so on this machine, you know you voted, you can see what the votes are on the paper trail, you assume that they're the same inside the machine as on the paper trail, and you can't prove that your vote was counted or not. So it's fundamentally different than banking. And also, election security, at least as far as voting machine goes, is badly misunderstood, because the question really is not, are the machines secure? Nothing in this world is secure. The question is, when you introduce the machines into the election process, do you close existing vulnerabilities in the process? And if you introduce any new ones in the process, can you handle those? So in other words, is the election safer or more secure, that's your goal, after the machines are in there than before? It's a relative thing. Now, let me introduce a couple of terms that I'll be using. BMDs, or ballot marking devices. These are, you take your ballot, you put it in the machine shows a screen and walks you through the various races. And at the end, the machine prints out or gives you back your ballot that's marked. And you then take that and cast that ballot. DRE stands for Direct Recording Electronic, and I have no idea who thought these names up. It's got to be someone in government who loves TLAs, three-letter acronyms. Okay. Basically, it records your vote electronically and stores it in memory. And the ones that I know of typically build a ballot image in memory of how you voted. Now, they record this and then they save it, and that somehow gets transmitted or brought into the counting area. And we'll go into that in more detail in a couple of minutes. For various reasons, many states require that the vote also be printed out on paper. And that is called, instead of a DRE with a paper trail, it's called a VVPAT, Voter Verified Paper Audit Trail. Okay? And those get printed at the same time you vote, and the way it's typically done is you press cast ballot, and the paper gets printed, and you can check visually that your votes are recorded correctly. Then you press cast ballot again, paper spools up, so others can't see how you voted, and the machine stores the electronic version of your vote. I think he just came out of a booth. Now, when votes are counted, they can be counted at the central election place, and so that's called central count. Votes can also be counted at the precincts or polling stations where you cast them, and typically that's done with scanners. You feed the paper into the scanner and it will save the paper ballot, but also do the counting on the ballot. And that's called PCOS, precinct count optical scanners. Okay, so now voting machines were introduced around 2002. After the Florida election of 2000, the federal government used a bill called HAVA, Help America Vote Act, to fund a lot of this. And the machines had a number of goals, one of which was to make certain that when a voter voted, the marking of the ballot or the storage of the vote was unambiguous. This arose in part because of the butterfly ballots in Florida. And so when they were introduced, a few problems started cropping up. In Boone County, Indiana, there were 19,000 voters and 144,000 ballots cast. So they had the man from the voting machine company come out and figure out which ones were real. In San Diego, in California, in an election in 2006, many polling stations opened late, like noon. And the reason for this was they couldn't boot the machines. They couldn't bring the machines up. In Alameda, they were able to open early because they had paper backups. You were using paper as a secondary system. But San Diego did not have any paper at the precincts. So they were turning people away and saying, come back later. It turned out that what had happened was the voting machine vendor made some last-minute changes to the software, put it up for what's called anonymous FTP. So in order to download it, the election officials had to enter the word anonymous and then give their mail address. And then they could download the software, and they were told to reinstall it on all the voting systems. The problem was it wasn't certified. And in California, all voting machine software is certified. And of course, it didn't work. This led to a hearing before the Secretary of State in which all voting machines in California were immediately decertified. They had to be recertified. And the vendor was told, don't bother asking us to recertify the machine that you install that software on. It's not going to happen no matter what you show us. This also led to the introduction of paper trails in California. There's a legal requirement now that that be done. In 2010, in the South Bronx, the Brennan Center did the New York equivalent of a FOIA request to look over the ballots. Got them, and it turned out that one of the scanners miscounted ballots in 2 elections. So there can even be errors there. Okay, now for a little bit of my history and how I got involved. In 2003, Maryland bought, I think it was 16,000 voting machines for use around the state. And an activist named Beth Harris found some source code on a website for the vendor that looked a lot like voting machine source code. So she downloaded it and it got passed over to Avi Rubin and his group. Yoshi Kono, by the way, a professor here, was one of the ones who was doing this analysis. They did the analysis, and probably the best way to sum it up was the code was terrible. There were all sorts of problems. The way Avi put it once was, had a first-year student written the code, he would have flunked them. So it was bad. Diebold's response was, anyway, the vendor's response was, well, that's okay, but that's not really our source code. That's just an old version, so don't worry about it. Maryland saw the report and got quite nervous, so they brought in SAIC. which looked over it and basically said you've got a large number of management problems that you can fix. As far as the source code goes, Professor Rubin is just as qualified as we are, and we're not going to redo his analysis. At that point, Maryland got really nervous and contacted a group called, issued a contract to a group called RABA for a penetration test. I was one of the penetration testers here. Now, our goal was they would set up a mock precinct and a mock counting station, local board of election. Our job was to rig the election. And it was run just like a rail election. We got hold of the source code 1 week in advance, did some very interesting analyses, and then on the day of the on the day of the test, we got into the machine that cast the votes and were able to reverse votes within about 2 minutes. It took us 30 minutes to get into the machine that counted the votes, but that was simply because it took us 25 minutes to get the piece of software from a graduate student that enabled us to break in. It turned out they were 16 security patches behind. And when we asked them, well, why don't you patch your system? They said, but then our software won't work. This also, by the way, is a very good example of how not to do cryptography. Cryptography is superb when it's done correctly, but it's a disaster when it's not. Among the mechanisms they used to transmit the votes informally was an implementation of a protocol called SSL. It's very similar to what's used on the internet now to do banking and things like that. But they implemented their own version of it. And SSL provides both assurance and authentication, but also confidentiality. It hides the data you transmit. Well, it turned out, as I said, they implemented half of it, the confidentiality half. Now, I don't know how it's done in Washington, but in California, the counts of votes at precincts are public. And so confidentiality should not have been an issue. But we didn't do this because we didn't want to jiggle the phone system. But had we done social engineering, we could very easily have intercepted the communication, gotten the password and login for Election Central for those particular people, gotten all their votes, changed them, and then sent them on. So basically, it was full of holes. The interesting thing about this was the goal of the penetration test was not to determine whether the machines would be used. It was to determine how to make them as safe as possible when they were used. And there's a huge difference in that wording. It turned out we made 23 recommendations. And if you read the conclusion, you'll see exactly what the test group thought of the software. Florida, in CD13, this was another one I was involved in, there was a race in which the Republican candidate beat the Democratic candidate by 235 votes, I think. Very low number, and there were other candidates who were way behind. But on the machines, 18,000 people were recorded as having cast ballots but not voting in that race. And so the question was, did the machine lose those votes? We did a very exhaustive analysis of the source code, and our conclusion was the source code did not cause or contribute to the undervotes. But if you want to rig the next election, you can. And we described roughly how to do that. They changed the software completely for the next election. This was an old version they were retiring. And so anyway, we did that analysis. Then in 2007, we had a Secretary of State named Deborah Bowen. She was elected from the state Senate and was very interested in privacy and technology. And one of her platform items was to do a full review of California's voting machines. She won. The University of California is the research arm of the state, so she led the contract. I led the red team and a team that was looking at accessibility. My colleague David Wagner at Berkeley led the source code review team and the team that was looking at the legal documents. The conclusion, at least of the red team report, and the source code team backed this up, was that the machines did not have the security or integrity necessary to ensure accuracy of the election counts or security of the machine. And Secretary of State Bowen decertified 3 machines immediately. The 4th one could be used, but only under very tightly controlled conditions. The other 3 had to be recertified. I mentioned the SSL thing. In Yolo County, we were asked by our election official to look at the machines. And among the things the machines did was, there was a judge's booth controller here and a machine here. When you went to vote, you got a 4-digit access code from the machine here. You entered it in the machine there, okay? If you could daisy chain these machines too, you could hook several of them up to that one station. And the station generated a random number. Now, the moment anyone, cryptographer, security person, hears the term random number, you start getting very, very nervous. And it turned out our nervousness was well placed because the graduate students who were doing this basically wrote down the first 200 numbers on a sheet of paper, did various manipulations, and then wrote down 100 other numbers, generated 100 numbers, and they matched. They had figured the exact pattern out. So in certain cases, not in our county, but on others, that would let you vote multiple times. And then Alec Assensack from Florida State University was asked to look at a Diebold change where they were digitally signing the ballots. I won't go into the details, but the bottom line was the ballot was digitally signed, but when they validated the signature, they only checked part of the signature. As a result, it took a grad student 2 days, using 2 days to write a program that would allow any ballot to be validated. And needless to say, that wasn't certified. So if you hear anyone say, well, cryptography can make voting safe, the question is, correct cryptography can make it safe. Bad cryptography doesn't help you. So bear that in mind. So the next question is assurance. How do we build these machines with assurance? First of all, assurance essentially is the accumulation of evidence to convince someone that a machine meets certain requirements. Okay? Who's someone? Is it the election officials? Is it the voters? Is it the vendors? Is it someone else? And that's where transparency comes in, because part of transparency is the ability to obtain that assurance. And it depends a lot on your target audience. So in order to get there, you need both standards and testing, and these have to be done independent of the developers. The reports that do the testing should show exactly what testing was done and what the results were. And for an electronic voting system, you really want to do what's called a penetration test, like we did with RAVA, where we tried to rig a mock election. So now, the US standards are being revised, and with any luck, the new ones will be out very soon. There are a number of groups working with NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, on this. But throughout now, they use standards that are somewhat old. The goal is to address what a voting machine should do. It doesn't say how you do it, it just says this is what you should do. Then, to show that your machine meets these standards, you go to what's called an independent testing authority. And they will do the testing and say whether or not you meet the standards. And if you don't, you have to fix it, and then you can bring it back to any of the other testing authorities. Okay? But they don't test, they test specifically to the standards that are given. Okay? So the question is, how good are the standards? It turns out that they have a number of problems. And I won't go again into much detail, but I will point out a couple. The first one is the standards have no mechanism, no procedural mechanism to show that the software that you got submitted for certification is the exact software used in the production units. And so that was the issue with what happened. The vendor in California was nailed not because of the violation of the standards, but because California law requires that software be certified. So in essence, they broke the law. There were a number of comments made at the hearing quite publicly. The second one here is availability. You want the machine to be available. Now, you only really care about the voting day, or the testing, or early voting. But notice the 163 hours. Why 163? The standards don't say. And a week is 168 hours. A day is 24 hours. Doesn't say. The other thing, too, is testing is done under laboratory conditions. Has anyone here ever tripped over a power cord and pulled it out of a computer? Okay? They don't test for that. Because they test in a laboratory where everything is nice and clean. Again, I don't know how Washington does things, but in California, when we have voting, our polling stations are often in garages or high school gymnasiums. And those are not as clean as labs typically are. So the key point here is that the labs, the standards have no threat model. They just say, here are the requirements, but they don't say why they pick those requirements. And they don't have any systems models. They don't say, how will the system be used and in what environments are we assuming it will be used. So that causes all sorts of interesting issues. Now there's a very interesting approach to this that a number of people have suggested, and it's a very, very good one. It's called software independence. And what it basically means is that you can prove the results of the election are correct even if the software is corrupt. And currently, as far as I know, the only way to do this is with paper. I would love to be proven wrong. Good. Good. The key issue here is the whole question of denial of service. But now, so when you add in the internet, things really start getting interesting. The internet is a worldwide web hooking up a lot of stuff. And of course, it is non-secure. There have been all sorts of stories about internet attacks, things like this. Now, let's say someone wanted to attack an election. How would they do it? Well, let's say we'll launch the attack over the internet. And there are basically a number of ways to do it. But the most interesting ones are really, first, they're not going to attack individual voting systems. If it's done correctly, those are air-gapped. So you can't cross that barrier. What they're going to do is attack the software and the source code, or anything you can use to update the system that you can move on a memory stick or something like that. Second thing they'll do is they'll hit the voter registration databases. Those are all on the internet. And imagine what would happen if 20,000 people were suddenly removed from the voter registration database. You'd have an awful lot of trouble. And now, also, if you vote over the internet, too, there are other issues as well, depending on how it's done. And the problem here is not the crypto. The crypto is good. It works. The problem is getting to the crypto in the first place. And that's where the attack is. Anybody here ever found a virus or a piece of malware on their home PC? Okay. How about your cell phone? Ever had any problems with cell phones? Okay, so if you're going to vote on either of those, before you can get to the part that bundles up the vote and sends it over the internet, you have to get through that. And you have to make sure that what is bundled up and sent over the internet is exactly what you wanted. Okay? And again, you can attack the vendors. The other problem with internet voting is very basic. The internet can suffer from what's called the denial of service attack. That's where you launch a lot of messages to one particular machine or set of machines and block legitimate traffic. This is incredibly effective. Now, if you're a bank, or if you're the US government or some other well-staffed organization, you can handle that. Just shift everything to another machine and you're off and running. And you have a large security staff that will help you close down the attack or thwart the attack. Again, I don't know the situation in Washington State, but I do know in California we have 2 system administrators and an election administrator. And we're better off than most counties. And also there's 2 machines, one that's never hooked up to the internet for counting the votes, and another one that does all the county's work. What happens if we do an election over the internet, and you're voting to our county server, and someone launches a denial of service attack on that? They only have to keep it up for the time the election is open. So this is another problem that will have to be overcome. And now with remote verification, now, a lot of the cryptographic mechanisms are really cool in that they not only allow you to vote, they allow you to check that your vote is counted accurately, and that you can verify this, but you can't prove it to others. The issue there is, again, I want to emphasize, not the cryptography. This was done by very good people who know their stuff much better than I would ever could hope to. But, again, the problem is in the non-crypto part. In one system we saw where they did this, it turned out they were using a program called JavaScript on a web browser to bring up the votes. And it turned out that there were a number of insecurities in the program they were using, so we could rig it to bring up any vote you like. To be fair, as soon as we pointed this out, they fixed it. But because their main focus was on the crypto and the accurate counting of the votes. But it's a good example of how the little things can really get you. Now, one other thing I do want to bring up, because I'm hearing this a lot. How many here have heard of blockchains? All right. I've been told that elections, no problem, we'll use blockchains, they'll be perfectly secure. All right? Basically, let me explain how a blockchain works, and then I'll show you why I have questions about this. Essentially, a blockchain takes a piece of information and computes a small value. It's called a cryptographic hash. You then have 2 keys. One of which is public and one of which is private. The keys are like passwords. You take your private one that only you know and use that to encipher the hash. And then you release it and the public key. Now anyone can validate that signature to show that the data was not changed by using the public key corresponding to the private key that protected it. So it sounds really good because you've got anonymity, right? You don't have to associate a name with these keys. And you've got integrity because they can't change anything in the blockchain without it being detected. But it turns out that there are a couple of problems with this. The issue is, how do you handle these? The first problem, which we've already gone through, is denial of service. The second is tied to the unique qualities of voting. How do you get those two passwords, those two keys? The way you do it for cryptocurrency is you generate them yourself. But then what's to stop me from generating 500 keys, voting 500 times, and then just putting the keys out without any association to my name? How would you detect that? The second one is, okay, we'll solve that problem by having the election officials issue you your key. Now they can tell how I voted. There is a way to do this with cryptography. But the way you do it ignores blockchains entirely. Essentially, when you vote provisionally, you take your ballot and put it into an inside sleeve or envelope, and then you put that into an outside sleeve or envelope, and your name is written on it and the reason for the challenge. You can effectively do the same thing with cryptography, using various combinations of cryptographic methods. That would work. But that has nothing to do with blockchains. So if anyone starts telling you we'll solve the problem with blockchains, start asking them questions like, how? Because I would really like to know. The other thing I've heard a lot is, well, we'll do a pilot test of the voting over the internet. We'll run an election over the internet, and that way we'll figure out whether or not it really works. Okay. You have this minor problem with testing. You need to know ground truth. You need to be able to determine when the test fails or when it succeeds. There is no legitimate computer scientist who will ever try to rig a real election. All right, aside from the fact it's a crime, it's also highly unethical. So if you do this in a real election, how do you know that the results are right? And there's plenty of evidence to show that internet elections in general are dangerous. Washington, D.C. decided to try one. And they were smart. They put everything out a couple of weeks before and said, okay, world, go at it. See what you can do. Okay? The folks up in Michigan, within 2 days, first they got in. They threw out all the Chinese and Iranian hackers who were already in there. Then they started playing with the voting machines, so that after you voted, instead of playing, the flag waving, it played the Wolverine fight song. Meanwhile, they also discovered that all of the security cameras were on the same network as the voting machines, so they could actually watch people voting. When this became public, Washington, D.C. immediately killed the test. But that's a good example of what people can do. So anyway, what I wanted to do was close with a couple of thoughts about questions to ask when you start looking at voting machines. And some of these probably will not apply to Washington State, but hopefully it'll get you into the right mindset. Understand that a voting system is not just voting system software, it's also an operating system of some kind. And by the way, if they say, oh, no problem, we wrote our own. Well, one of the machines we broke very, very quickly in the California test used a homebrew operating system. And we did not have, the people who did the breaking did not have the source code for that. They did the break, and then everything with the source code, people came in and went, good, and verified the fact that they were able to explain exactly how it worked. Also, how do you get the systems ready for use? In California, they used to have what they may still in some places have called sleepovers, where poll workers would take the machines home the night before the election, or in some cases a week before the election, and then be able to drive them out to the state. How does the system associate votes with voters? If the answer to this is, well, it's complicated, that's the wrong answer. Okay? Can voters change their votes? The answer should be no. Also, how do you check enforcements of limits on voting in a race? If there are 5 candidates for 2 seats, how do you make sure that at most people vote for 2? Some of these are easy to do, but like I say, they're interesting questions to ask. The one here, the big one here, I think is number 2 and number 3. Number 2 is, what assumptions do you make about the procedures and the support? Because very often the procedure is, well, let's call the voting machine company and get some help. And that may be good, that may be bad, but it's something you should know about. Then the next one is how do you verify the voting system accurately recorded votes cast independent of the system? There are cryptographic methods for doing this that work assuming all the software works. Paper trails works as well. In fact, in California, at least in our county, they don't count the votes cast electronically electronically. They count them by taking out the paper tapes and reading the paper tapes. In the last election, we had 20 people vote on the machines. The first time they were used, there were 200 people voting on the machines. This is out of 40,000. And what was really interesting was that many of the election officials who were in the polling stations had no idea how to use the machines. Our registrar set up a small group of high school students and undergraduates to go around and help them do this. And sometimes in one case they found a machine with a big sign taped on it saying free kittens. And there was a box of kittens under the machine. So the reactions were very interesting. Then, again, what are the requirements and how do you know that it meets them? How do you handle updated software? As I mentioned, that was an issue before. Let's see, what happens if something goes wrong? Do you lose votes? In one of the machines we tested, we accidentally kicked the plug out, and the machine lost 2 votes that had not been cast, 2 ballots that hadn't been fully stored. Is that a problem? Well, that's something you need to know. And also, what about corruption? Who will guard the people who are guarding the systems? This was as old as Rome, which is why I put it up there in Latin. Also, when you do the testing, one of the problems we had was getting access to the voting machine software and documentation. And in fact, in the top to bottom review test, which was 5 weeks long, we got a lot of the documents the week before the test was to end. And that's simply not enough time to do the type of analysis you want. In another case, we asked for a particular piece of software and we did not get it until 1 day before it ended. It didn't really matter because the software was the software that would load the program onto the voting machine. When we realized we were going to have trouble getting it, the source code team and the attack team and the penetration team got together, spent an afternoon in Sacramento, and figured out the protocol. So we got what we wanted even before they gave us the source code. And that's a good example, by the way, of when people say, well, we can't tell you that, we can't show you our machine or our software because that would let the bad people see it and otherwise it would be completely non-secure. Saying that is good as one step of security. Saying that is bad as the only step. So I guess a couple of takeaways. Know the requirements of an election so you can define what you want. This is absolutely critical. What I've said depends very highly on the definition of on the requirements of current elections. Change those, and a lot of what I will say will probably go out the window. The second one is in security, you always assume something can go wrong. And it's not necessarily because of malevolence. It may simply be because someone didn't know what they were doing. And you have to be prepared to compensate for that. And also, internet voting poses great risks. The specific risks depend on how you do it. I've seen some internet voting that uses cryptography that is atrocious. I've seen other schemes that use cryptography that is superb. The problem there is not the crypto, it is getting the information to the crypto. Okay. And again, to close with an old saying and a new one. The first one has been attributed to dictators under the sun. Those who vote decide nothing. Those who count the votes decide everything. I'd like to modify that by saying those who vote decide nothing. That which records, sends, gathers, and counts the votes decides everything. And updating. And with that, I think I'll conclude. First of all, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. If there are any answers, I'd be even happier. Yes, sir.
What do you think of the various open source efforts for doing election software?
Okay, to answer that, my view of transparency is that everything in the election should be observable. This is me speaking as a citizen, not as a scientist. A scientist doesn't define those requirements, others do. Given that, my opinion is open source is essential. My big fear, though, is people will say, well, this machine can't be attacked. I mean, it's open source, so you know everything that's going on. And that's a big mistake. So I consider open source,
It's
again,
prerequisite that it's not sufficient.
right. In my view, as a citizen, it's necessary but not sufficient. Yes, sir.
So we use mail-in ballots.
Yes.
What are our weak points?
Okay, it depends a lot on exactly how that's implemented, but here are two right off. First of all, what's called coercion.
Who's counting?
No, who's count, actually, the way we do things, the way at least our county does things, mail-in ballots, once they hit the election central, are actually handled the same way provisionals are, and it's very safe. What they do is they take the envelope and validate the signature. If it doesn't match, they look to see if anyone else lives at that address. And if it's a married couple, then they'll validate the signature against the spouse. If not, they will call the person and say, did you send this in? Then what they do is, if it's validated, they open up the envelope, the outer envelope, take the inner envelope and walk it across the room and put it in a pile. Walk back, someone else comes in and opens that envelope, and that breaks the association between name and person. So who's counting them? The only threat would be if someone intercepted it and opened both. Okay. However, the coercion is a bit of a problem. The U.S. mail can be a bit of a problem. And so, also, you can argue that selling your vote is a problem. However, the issue there is you take a picture of your ballot before you mail it. The problem with selling your vote is if you're a dishonest person, you take a picture of the ballot, you then change your vote, and then you mail it in. In California, we use what's called intent of the voter standard. So if two things are marked and one of them is scribbled over, the machine will the scanners kick it out. But the election official will take one look at it and say, no, take this vote, pointing to the one that's not scribbled out. Of course, we had someone do that and the person signed their name. That invalidates the entire ballot immediately because in California, anything on the ballot that points to the voter means the ballot can't be used. It's one of the problems we're going to have if we switch to cryptographic systems involving random numbers, because the ballots will be uniquely marked and that's not allowed under the law. So there are a lot of issues here. Anyway, vote by mail, I don't know if that increases participation. The League of Women Voters would know that much better than I do. A little bit, okay, yeah, I do know that the test they did in Hawaii with vote by phone, they had fewer people involved. But the security issues there are simply the coercion, selling the vote, and the denial of service and not delivering it.
So, in general, it sounds as good as anything.
It's, no, because there are ways to avoid the coercion and the selling your vote. And the denial of service. So I would say no.
Okay.
On the other hand, again, it's a judgment of the body politic whether or not the disadvantages of doing it that way outweigh the advantages of doing it that way. And that's something I'm not going to talk about in this forum. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you think it would be good, reasonable, bad to have a single procedure nationwide?
I'm sorry, a single
Nationwide
procedure.
for voting to better manage the whole process?
Okay, two comments. The first one is that I don't think you could do that even if you wanted to because of the way the states work. The second comment is that if you have one single procedure, then the flaws are going to be the same everywhere. The third question is, how detailed are you going to make that procedure? Because in California, the state law controls how people run elections. But each of the 58 counties have slightly different ways of doing it. And so if you take that away, you're going to have to, the laws will have to go into a lot of detail, for example, about what machines you're going to use and so forth. So I'm not sure it would buy you much. Yes.
So what's the safest way to vote? Sounds like everything's flawed.
That's right.
So one isn't any better than the
So,
other.
What's the question?
the question is, so what's the safest way to vote? As of now, probably in person.
Ah, okay.
We're going to go ahead and stop questions here. But again, another round of applause. We're going to have more time for questions at the end as well, so if you've still got something on your mind, be sure to save it. So our next speaker will be discussing end-to-end verifiable elections, which allow a voter to verify that their vote is both cast and counted accurately. Josh Benelo is a senior cryptographer at Microsoft Research and an affiliate professor in the University of Washington School of Computer Science and Engineering. His 1987 dissertation, Verifiable Secret Ballot Elections, introduced the use of homomorphic encryption and its application to achieving election integrity without requiring trust in election officials, vendors, or equipment. Welcome, Josh.
No, I probably shouldn't put that in. And what I realized that I should have put in, and I failed to mention, the most salient thing that I should have included, is that I'm currently serving, I'll work on this, I'm currently serving on the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on the Future of Voting, and we expect to issue a report in late summer. Hopefully it'll be interesting. Point you to that, direct you, but look, late summer, we should have some interesting things to say. That came up, that's good. And I want to amplify a lot of what Matt said. Only things are, in many cases, worse. What he said about blockchain voting, it's worse. There's so many things wrong with that. Yet, the state of West Virginia yesterday announced that blockchain voting pilot, they're going to be doing it. Yep. Yesterday. So I guess the place I'll start is looking at how bad things are. And that, yes, I agree with everything that you included, but I will also add to that. Let me get this on and working before a quote from Alex Halderman at the University of Michigan, who Matt mentioned was part of that DC pilot attack. Alex said that his undergraduate security class could have changed the results of the 2016 election. And I completely believe it.
Why did Russians come
You're not the first one to have asked that question.
I've never said that for exactly that reason.
Yes, yes. But he was heavily involved in the recounts in Michigan and in other states, and some of the things he saw were horrifying. You would think that it's hard to attack many counties at once, but there are actually 3 little tiny companies of about 12 to 20 employees each, with no IT departments or anything, that are responsible for most of the county's elections. Basically, they service the machines, they deploy the machines, they set up the ballots. You attack them, you've got the whole state, basically. And there are other forms of attack, but yeah, it's really bad. And it's worse in some ways because of this. We should, of course, be using best practices, doing the things that Matt is very good at, doing the things that we can to avoid all the bad practices that are out there. We should certainly be doing that. But it's not enough. And it's not enough in part because this threat is asymmetric. Yeah, I would like it if King County and Island County and San Juan County and every county in this state, for instance, were doing everything they could. But do I really think that San Juan County is able to stand up to the Russian FSB or APT-1 in Shanghai or North Korean governmental attack? And that's not just, King County also. I don't want to pick on small counties in the state. It's just, there's no way that we can reasonably expect that we can defend against the kinds of attacks that may be out there. So what can we do? Now's the time when I turn around and actually offer a glimmer of hope. Now when things are darkest. So, Kristen mentioned a little bit about end-to-end verifiability. And this is technology that actually permits any inaccuracies, any tampering at all, to be detected. And when I say detected, I'm not just talking about detected by election officials. Things can be detected by candidates, by media, by individual voters. An individual voter can check and see if something went wrong. And when I say something went wrong, I don't just mean an attack by the Russian FSB. This includes internal tampering, tampering and corruption by election officials, by equipment vendors, anywhere along the line. This is actually possible. It sounds wonderful, right? Sounds great. Well, this technology is called end-to-end verifiability. And an election is end-to-end verifiable if two properties are met. One is that voters can verify that their own selections have been correctly recorded. And second requirement is that anybody can verify that all the recorded votes have been accurately counted. Okay? Seems really, really good if we could do this. Well, I'd love to tell you about how. I could probably do it thoroughly in about 90 minutes, give you some detail. I'll give you the 90-second version because I don't have 90 minutes to do that. But before I do, I want to amplify one other thing that Matt was talking about, a little teaser here, and talk about the importance of privacy in elections, and the hard thing being that in elections, voters must not be able to disclose how they voted, even if they wanted to. And in the Washington case, I'll give a quick anecdote about this. I was doing some data entry at local party headquarters in the 2016 election. Basically, canvassers were sent out to go and ask people, have you received your ballot? Have you returned your ballot? Will you share information on who you voted for? Who do you like? Whatever. All voluntary, of course. And the canvassers would go out and fill out these little bubble sheets. And I was back at headquarters doing data entry on these bubble sheets. I have drop-down menus. There's nothing that I can do with anything but filling in the bubbles. And as soon as I fill this in, the canvassing information gets shredded. So there's no reason for anybody to write anything other than filling in the bubbles. That's the only thing that's kept. But some of the canvassers really felt obligated in some cases, and I was seeing some really interesting things. And one thing I saw many times in just my small little case, I'll give the clearest example of it. The response to, have you returned your ballot, was written in, I don't know, my husband took it. That exists in Washington State, and I saw a lot of similar things to that also. That's just the most concise example. So this is the kind of thing that we enable with remote voting, when we're not voting in person, just to be aware of it. Okay. It would, however, be really nice from a security and integrity perspective if we could have open ballot elections. It would be so much easier. And this is not something that is just sort of a crazy thought, we would never have done this. Most presidents in the US were elected without the benefit of a secret ballot. It was actually 1892 that secret ballot first became common. This is what elections used to look like in the US. It's sort of a completely open process. You go up and you announce your vote and people are listening and whatnot. I'm not proposing that we go back to this. Believe me, I don't want to do it. But let's just look and think about what it would do for election integrity if we did this. And I'll give you the modern version of that. A website where you capture everybody's vote. Everybody can look and say, yep, my vote is up there accurately. All the other voters, they're on the voter rolls. Whether the voter rolls are accurate or not is sort of a side issue, but that's important as well, of course. But they're supposedly legitimate voters, and see whether they're on the rolls. They know they have the opportunity to check for themselves, and I can check the count for myself. This is really a high integrity election, and this meets all of the requirements of end-to-end verifiability that I just gave you. Okay, but I'm cheating, right? I've gotten rid of privacy, and I've achieved end-to-end verifiability. So, how can we do that and actually have it secret ballot also? And here is where the little bit of cryptography comes in, and I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but it's possible to encrypt all the votes, still post all the encrypted votes, and then what you have to do is provide two things. You have to provide voters a way that they can tell what their vote is and see that their vote is accurately recorded without being able to show anybody else what their vote is. And it turns out this is possible. And the other thing we have to be able to do, and this is another cryptographic trick, is show that that set of encrypted votes really corresponds to the tally. And this is all math. And I'm not going to talk about that now. If anybody wants to learn more about it, I'm happy to talk to you offline. I don't want to bore people with that. The interesting thing is this front end part, where voters get to check how their vote is recorded. And basically, the trick is that voters get to see something at the time that they are voting that can give them convincing evidence. And then they go away with a receipt. Exactly the sort of receipt that Matt was talking about would be very nice if you were doing home banking. But the receipt doesn't say how they voted. The receipt just matches up with the encryption that they had an opportunity while they were voting to make sure it matched up with their vote. So they can check this receipt and they can see, yeah, my vote hasn't changed from the time that it was recorded and I knew what it was, but I have no way to prove to anybody else what my vote is because it's just, it's like a UPS tracking code at this point. It doesn't show how I voted. Okay, it's not something that's speculative out there. This is actually technology that's existed for decades. And it's not just one thing. There are multiple, very different ways of achieving these things. But there have been a lot of refinements that have been made recently that make this practical, just at a time when we really could use this. So what's the experience? Is anyone actually doing this? There have been some small cases in public elections in the Netherlands. Tacoma Park, Maryland is a suburb of Washington, D.C. that spells its name weirdly. They used technology that does this in public elections a couple of times. There's an internet-based system, which I wouldn't recommend for public elections, but many university elections and professional society elections are using this kind of a system rather than sending out paper ballots, which is expensive and complicated and inaccurate for them. And this works pretty well there. I was a part of a team that designed an end-to-end verifiable system for use in Austin, Texas, a couple of years ago. It was paper-based. It really met their needs very well. Beautiful system. We loved it. We did it in concert with the officials in Travis County. They really wanted to do it. Just a quick look. It looks very much like what you expect. You go in, you sign in, you go to one of these ballot marking devices that Matt mentioned, you make your selections, you get out a piece of paper which indicates, here are my selections, and you get one of these receipts, these take-home receipts. And you then can drop the ballot in the ballot box, go home. What most people will do with a take-home receipt is probably crumble it up and throw it away. That's okay, but they can check it on a website and say, oh yeah, look at that, my vote's still there. I can't show anybody that what the contents are, but I can see that my vote. I can check it. Okay. Went really well until a few months ago. It got canceled. Long, sad story. I'm happy to give you some. Well, I'm sad to give you details, but I will provide details on request. Basically, they ran out of money, even though in the end it would have cost them much less. But there were some upfront costs that they just didn't have, and the existing election companies really pushed hard to try to get this killed. Because it would have disrupted their whole current model. But it would have been much cheaper. They could have used off-the-shelf equipment instead of this ugly custom hardware that the current vendors sell at grossly inflated prices with huge maintenance contracts that are even worse because they've got, once you buy them, you've got to maintain them. They could have bought cheap laptops instead if they'd done this. But they couldn't get the money for the initial development. Okay. Is more being done? Well, here's the centralization question that came up. The Election Assistance Commission in the US, the federal agency that's in charge of trying to create standards, has new standards coming out in mid-2018. And one thing they've done in their standards, in the standards that are being developed, this is a draft, they haven't been issued yet, but the draft of these standards say that elections to meet their requirements in the future should be either paper-based or have this end-to-end verifiable property. Now they can be both. StarVote was both. That's the best, I think. But the reason for this is they really want some way of providing accommodations for voters with various disabilities, especially blind voters. Paper and blind voters don't go very well together, even though paper is really good for elections in many ways. And this is saying, okay, here's a way to make accommodations for blind voters, use this end-to-end verifiability, and that's good enough as well. That provides a lot of this. And there's a paperless instance. End-to-end verifiability achieves the software independence that Matt was talking about, together with sort of hardware independence and human independence. Basically, any of those things that go wrong, we can check. So, what's next? Well, Matt talked about internet voting a little bit. There's a lot of push, a lot of people, blockchain internet voting, other forms of internet voting, people want to do it. There's a big, strong push towards this. 3 years ago, I was part of a report that the US Vote Foundation commissioned. And we looked hard at this, and what we said was, end-to-end verifiability makes internet voting a lot better than it would be without. It mitigates a lot of the problems. Is it good enough? Well, you shouldn't do it without, certainly. But you really should get some experience with end-to-end verifiability in poll sites first. And then maybe we can start talking about internet voting later on, but not a great idea now. So it can make things better, right across the board. Should be done. I'd love it to be done. I'm happy to take more questions. And I've got another slide where I sort of answer the question. Well, I'll throw this in. My subjective ranking, because the question was asked earlier, what's the best voting system? So here's my sense. In-person, paper-based, end-to-end verifiable, that's the very best you can do. It's got all these things. I think anybody in the security community would pretty much agree with this. Now, the next two, I think even paperless end-to-end verifiability in-person is really good. Some people will switch this with in-person, paper-based without internet verifiability. Okay, that's debatable. Those are the reasonable alternatives. Below this, internet voting with end-to-end verifiability, I think is probably the next best. Again, Matt might argue, others might argue with this. Paperless, in-person, gets even worse. As a proud Washington voter, I love vote by mail as a voter. But what's worse than that? Well, just naked internet voting is even worse. And I know of one thing that's even worse than naked internet voting. By email. I think there's general agreement that that's the worst that we can possibly do. Okay, so that's all I have to say.
And we'll save questions for Josh till the end. Since we're running a little late, we're going to go right into our panel here. So if we can have our panel come on up. We've already introduced Josh and Matt and Barbara. I'd also like to introduce Representative Zach Hudgens. Representative Zach Hudgens has served Washington's 11th legislative district, which includes parts of South Seattle, South King County, and suburbs since 2002. He serves as the chair of the House State Government Elections and Information Technology Committee, and he is a nationally recognized leader on information technology. Additionally, he is a member of the National Conference of State Legislators Cybersecurity Task Force. Welcome, Representative Hudgens. All right, so I'm just going to do a brief intro before we get started with our panel. Just kind of an overview of what we're going to be covering here. Over the last few months, report after report has come out from a wide range of governmental and non-governmental organizations with recommendations on how states can improve their election security. The recurring theme from these reports is simple: use paper ballots and perform robust, statistically based post-election audits. So how are we in Washington faring with these recommendations? As a vote-by-mail state, you might think all of our votes are cast on paper. But where we aren't meeting the paper ballot standard is with email return of ballots. Washington allows service and overseas voters to return their ballot via email attachment or fax, and there's no requirement that they additionally mail in a paper ballot. Washington also allows all voters, even those in state, to return their ballot via email attachment. And this is without a doubt, Washington has the most lenient email ballot laws in the country. In the November 2016 election, over 17,000 ballots were returned via email or fax statewide. Once a marked ballot is uploaded onto a voter's computer, it's no longer paper, it's a digital file, and digital files can be manipulated. So turning to the panel here, can you describe some of the security concerns with returning a ballot over email?
Number one, email is not sorry. Number one, email is not secure. Number two, I suspect that the email version used does not provide any assurance of integrity. Number three, email has been known to get lost, bounce around the internet for a while and disappear. So what this boils down to is people can see how you voted. There's no privacy because your address is attached to the email. If bits are dropped, as sometimes happens, or if someone changes it, then that goes through and you won't detect it. If someone votes for you, how are you sure that you actually cast the vote as opposed to someone voting for you? You know, just to help you out because you're so busy. Fourth is, you receive email back saying we received it?
You know, I believe some counties send out a receipt.
For whatever it's worth, I know of a couple of other states that do this for service people, but what they have to do is also put in a signed statement saying we understand we are waiving our rights to a secret ballot. So anyway, those are the ones that come to mind off the top of my head. I'm sure everybody has others.
I'll add just a little bit, because Matt mentioned earlier the comparison between ATM banking and voting. And when you buy something online, you send your credit card, you're using some secure protocols to do that. That actually works reasonably well, although you do get, you buy something and the wrong thing comes, you can tell. You get double charged, you can tell. If your vote gets changed, you can't. But that's the security you get with an internet transaction using SSL or TLS or one of these secure channels. Email doesn't even have that. Email is just this raw thing on an electronic postcard. And I've seen demonstrations where you send email to an address and somebody in between can take that email and take a PDF, and when it reaches that address, suddenly that PDF says something different. And it's not undoable, it's very doable.
As an example, many years ago, when I worked at NASA, one of our administrators expressed some surprise that email could be forged. Within about 3 minutes, he got a letter from Opus the Penguin at the White House asking for no more Kimbered herring heads at the get-togethers.
Is this being taped? Because I don't think I've ever been on a panel with 3 PhDs. And my mom always wanted me to go to grad school. She's a PhD in economics. So I grew up around, not intimidated, but my mom would want me to have the letters behind my name. What's interesting to me about this discussion is that a lot of it comes down to prioritizing the criteria you are using. And we've got some fundamental criteria, like privacy. We believe in the secret ballot. But you brought up that we have not always had that. I'll mention that that picture you put up there had no women in it. And so we're at the League of Women Voters. The old ways are not always the best ways. And there's certainly some benefit to it. So it's about prioritizing. Are you prioritizing the speed of your count? So if you do everything by paper, it's kind of slow getting the results sometimes. And even in our mail ballots, it's a question of do we have them due on election day or due afterwards. Different states do it differently. So speed, privacy, accuracy. And as you start building this prioritization of criteria you want, access has to come in there at some point. And so this is where I'm going to throw in a plug for 5 bills we just passed in Olympia to broaden access to democracy. A lot of these policies were not new policies. Same-day voter registration is one that gets a lot of even reasonable folks a little worried about somebody showing up on election day to vote. But Wisconsin's been doing it since the 1970s. And so you have to figure out how do we, the most secure elections are the ones where it's like 3 people and you're deciding where to go to dinner, right? I mean, like, that's an easy election. And if people want to stand up and say, I voted, and this is who I voted for Jefferson or Adams, good examples, then I have to stand by that vote. And in public office, my votes are all public, and that's a good thing, so that you can hold me accountable. But that is also dependent on folks being relatively reasonable and nice and not stalking me at my house, threatening me over a vote or not. So we have to manage what the criteria is and how we're setting that up. So the problems with email voting, and I'll bring up that the King County Conservation District, since you all live in King County, is a taxing jurisdiction. They have authority to tax all of us here, and they use email voting in their elections. And they get terrible turnout, which is one of the reasons they went to email, is they're like, nobody is turning out for these people that are being elected to deal with tax dollars. And so they've gone to like the least secure method at all. The other thing I'll mention, not just about the email stuff, is a little bit about sort of well, I'll just leave it there, I'll come back.
I'm putting myself in your shoes, and I'm looking at the different reactions to what you're hearing. And you're probably wondering what to listen to and how to give weight to the information that you've been receiving. So I want to give you 2 big ideas that are at the 150,000 foot level that might be helpful to you as you think through, as the people who ultimately, the citizens, are going to decide what our election systems are going to look like. I'm going to give you a couple of big ideas that may help. Number 1, we've all been blessed by this incredible digital revolution, right? It's transformed our lives and made things easier. The dirty little secret is that this is an entirely insecure environment that we're working in. And this is something that Matt alluded to. So we're used to coming from the pre-digital age. We depended on the post office box. We depended on all of the industrial age activities that supported our lives. We didn't think about them much. We invested trust. And so we've taken that same investment of trust and transferred them to things digital. But I hate to break it to you. All of that digital infrastructure does not deserve your trust. Now, it probably didn't bother you when you got those notices from the bank or the credit card companies that your identity been stolen. They probably just reissue your card. And you don't see the direct impacts financially of what those losses cost the bank, because the bank eats it. And of course, they're rolled up in fees that they eventually charge to you, but there's no direct impact, correct? Mm-hmm. But now, all of a sudden, with so many millions of people on Facebook and so much energy around this last election, the individual person is starting to ask, what in the heck is going on? So I want to tell you, first and foremost, that the environment that you're working with is not secure. You cannot 100% secure it. Now, let's put that in perspective. You take a risk when you walk across the street, right? So now you have to deal with relative risk. And so there's some environments that over time have become better than others. You've just heard tonight about one system that hasn't. The second thing I want you to think about is when we think systems, those of us that grew up before these digital devices were part of our everyday lives, when we hear electronic voting system or voting system, I think most of us imagine technology, do we not? When we think about email, you think about your computer, the wires, the wireless interconnection, the servers. You're thinking about the technical infrastructure, right? Isn't that what you think about? It's something mysterious that only brainiacs know about. It's certainly nothing I understand. I just simply trust it. It's all that technology stuff out there. The dirty little secret is that you have to think systemically about these systems and think about where you draw that boundary. The boundary is not just the technology. It includes all those pesky people that are in that system. So you need to be thinking that the systems we're talking about are not just the computers and the wires, the internet devices, the servers, all those things you hear about. It's also the people that interact with that system. The people that are repairing it, the people that are updating it, the people that are managing it, the people that are writing the code. All of those people are involved. What do we know about people? They are the weakest link in the system, period. Some are evil, some are forgetful, some are lazy, some had a bad day. You know, all kinds of human frailty is involved with managing our systems. So when you think about systems in that regard, you end up with that picture that Matt and Josh have painted for you of what happens in an actual setting. And so when you're evaluating systems, electoral systems, you have to think big picture system. Now I'm going to make a confession in front of this group. I've never even explained this to people that work with me. I grew up at a time when a relative passed. I won't say what relationship to me, but he happened to be chair of a political party most of his life. And I grew up in later years hearing all the stories of stuffing ballot boxes. So I've had an orientation. I grew up back east. I had an orientation around elections, colored a little bit about that colorful early life that this gentleman had. So we've had problems with elections. It's just that bringing it into that digital environment increases the complexity, the vulnerabilities, the speed at which problems can happen. So what I would really recommend, if you're on a committee that's looking at evaluating a system, I want you to think about system big picture and identify all the aspects of the system. And then go through the vulnerability assessment. Matt's talking about the pen testing that they did. But you can think through vulnerabilities. You're imaginative. You watch Hercule Poirot, right? You watch all those murder mysteries. So put yourself in the shoes of a bad guy. Now what's interesting is you have several kinds of bad guys. And that threat spectrum has changed over time. From individual bad actors that like to cause mischief, to people that want to monetize things. They're easy to figure out, right? They're looking to make a buck. The nation-state problem is more complex. And so if you put yourself in the mind of an adversary that's attacking infrastructure, whether it's the electric grid, whether it's the electoral system, then you can start thinking about, you can think the way Josh and Matt think. This is what they do for a living. They think like bad guys, and they look for the vulnerabilities. And so you need to have that kind of thinking at play when you're thinking about a decision about election systems. So that's enough said, but I wanted to perhaps set a context for you that might be helpful to evaluate the kinds of things we are talking about here.
And we can get away from a lot of the vulnerabilities of machines and software, not entirely, but somewhat, when we have the paper, because the paper is the original record of the voter's intent that we can then look back upon if needed. And so we're going to switch gears here and turn our attention to post-election audits. This is an area where Washington has been described as lacking in election security. But this past legislative session, a bill was passed, sponsored by Representative Hudgens, giving Washington election officials the option to perform post-election risk-limiting audits. Risk-limiting audits are resoundingly recommended by numerous national election integrity organizations, including the League of Women Voters. So I was hoping Representative Hudgens, can you expand a little bit upon this type of audit and the legislation that was passed?
I was reluctant to talk about math before I showed up, and now more reluctant. Last year, between legislative sessions, I went to an elections conference put up by the National Council, National Conference of State Legislators. It's a national organization, nonpartisan, that builds resources and offers resources for legislators and staff across the country. You should check them out, ncsl.org. If you want to find out about policy of who supports it, who implements it, for example, on same-day voter registration or on risk-limiting audits, they've got a page up. They've got some great folks that deal with this stuff. Wendy Underhill is their expert on elections. So I went to this conference, and one of the things that different folks were talking about came up a few times, risk-limiting audits, risk-limiting audits. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. I wonder what they are. I need to learn some more. And nobody back home had ever heard of these things. And so it took staff a couple of months to work through whether they would work here. It took a lot longer with the county auditors who implement elections and administer elections to put them together. And I put it as part of our, what I called our election integrity bill. So 2406 was the bill number, in case you want to go look it up. I usually try not to say bill number because it's super boring, but we just passed a bill that would basically take best practices from around the state and say, what are auditors doing, and then add to that. And so random sampling of the ballots, for example, auditing and certification of the machines, and then we added risk-limiting audits in there, and finally we had independent outside audits come in to check things. So each county is doing one of those things, and we said every county has to do one of these four. Pick one of them, and then we made post-election audits mandatory. So right now it's permissive. We said you have to do this. We put in notification requirements around software breaches. So if your vendor's machine has a problem in another state, there's no state requirement that says that you have to do anything about it. I mean, the vendor has no incentive to tell us if they've had a problem in Virginia or North Carolina or Minnesota or someplace. So now we have a state requirement that says if you've got a problem someplace, you have to tell us, and then the Secretary of State can pull that machine or all of those machines out of service right away. Trying to react to sort of a real-time situation a little bit better. And also we made the reconciliation reports a little bit more robust. Reconciliation reports are great things. They came out of the 2004 election cycle where we had a very close governor's race. And so it's a standard form. Every county has to do this around where your votes are coming from. Are they overseas ballots? Are they election ballots? Are they email ballots? Where did they come from? You mentioned how many email ballots came in. About 50% of those are rejected because you're required to send in your paper ballot afterwards. And so about 50% of those are rejected. I think rejection rates are way too high, and you can go check on the reconciliation reports, see what percentage in your county is being rejected every time. So with risk-limiting audits, that's sort of how they fit into this whole package. Colorado has done risk-limiting audits. They've done them by initiative. It's now the talk of the town. This is the gold standard for election audits. And I had to fight a little bit with the auditors to actually get it in the law, but now we've got it in the law. My expectation is that there will be an election administrator who believes that these are supposed to be more accurate and save money and less work. And like, who doesn't want more accurate and save money and less work? And it's the gold standard. So I think somebody will try them because now it's an option. It wasn't an option 3 weeks ago, and the bill has now been signed. So it creates an audit trail, and then the risk limit basically sets, the Secretary of State will set the limit, and so that a 5% risk limit means you've got a 95% confidence level of the ballots being properly tabulated. So I mean there's more math behind it, but that's where I'll say that what you're trying to do is look for where there's the most statistically significant deviation, or where there's a problem, or where a problem would make a difference, which goes at sort of some of this discussion about election integrity. To me, is not just about throwing an election. So it's not just about stuffing ballot boxes. I actually think in Washington State it's kind of tough to stuff a ballot box for a lot of reasons. Most of it's unknown. You don't know what the turnout's going to be. You don't know how close it's going to be. So the professor from Michigan said he could have thrown the election. Well, afterwards you know how narrow it is in which state, so you can go back, oh yeah, okay. But going into an election, nobody thought Donald Trump would be president of the United States. Nobody thought it was going to be that close and where. It makes it a lot more difficult to predict the future and then to do the nefarious thing. All they want to do, though, is blow up our trust and disrupt things. Smaller elections, you might have some influence over, depending on the turnout, a county council or something. But I'll go back to your statement about the people. Look at who we're electing, I mean, me too. Like, we've got good people, we've got bad people, like, we're just regular. even the best people make mistakes sometimes. And so if it's the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, or these extraterritorial, whoever's the ISIS or whatever, the biggest defense in some ways is not only focusing on the technology. We need to focus on the technology, but if we had a 90% turnout, the will of the people would be pretty clear, probably. And if not, then guess what? There's a lot of people paying attention to how that process plays its way out. And then people are turned out the next time. So that civic robustness is the most important thing in our elections. And whether we're voting by raising our hands or whether we're sending something in, whether it's a hand recount or whether it's a risk limiting audit at the back end, it works best when we have a robust civic life. Thank you, League of Women Voters. It is most helpful when people are tuned in, when they recognize that decisions are being made, have an impact on their lives, and that when you elect good people, it makes a difference, and when you elect yahoos, it makes a difference in a bad way. And when we don't have enough candidates running, and when people can't stand the mudslinging and whatever else it is, that is almost more detrimental to our democracy than some of the stuff that the Russians can do, because they're doing it on the edges. And they're playing on our fears, or the Chinese, or whoever it is that wants it done. Most of the worry should be about our fellow citizens participating and not necessarily about these outside entities. The risk limiting audits, a better focus on these things will have a better, will help us maintain some integrity in that process. And so that's kind of the package around that bill that was just signed last week.
I want to add my congratulations and applaud you and your work on Bill 2406. I think that was a great thing. It's a great improvement. I want to just add a couple of little things. First, minor correction, technical. A 5% risk limiting audit doesn't mean 95% confidence that the tally was correct.
That was the only explanation I gave, though.
You're
very kind, thank you.
It's 95% confidence that the correct winner was chosen. The tally could be way off, but 95% confidence in the correct outcome in terms of who won, which is, of course, the most important thing. But I want to be careful there. Risk limiting audits are great. We should do them. We should do them everywhere. I want to be careful. We're following Colorado in the pilots that they did, and we need to pilot them and experiment them. This is a start. We need to do much more to actually put real risk limiting audits in place in every contest, in every election. And this legislation is a start. It's good. We need to go further. I do want to emphasize, though, that risk limiting audits are not perfect. It's a good step. It does a lot. It's a lot better than many things we have, but it doesn't check everything. Auditing is great, but risk limiting audits and typical other forms of auditing are audits against machine errors. It's not an audit against things like election officials who are either corrupt or careless. I'll be generous and say careless. If their processes are not ideal, there can still be errors that will not be caught by risk limiting audits. Also, there are problems with software that can come up, because you have software that helps with the risk limiting audit. And if the software that helps with the risk limiting audit is in collusion with the software that's doing the initial counting, then a risk limiting audit won't catch that. So that's why I go back to the emphasis on the end-to-end verifiability, which is also effectively a form of auditing, which catches all software errors, all hardware errors, all human errors. It's harder, but it's harder at first to get that in place. And there's this math that scares people in the background. But from a voter perspective, it's no harder, it's just as good. The only thing I have to say as a caveat is I know how to do end-to-end verifiability in person, paper elections, paperless elections. I know how to do it for internet. I don't really know a good way of doing end-to-end verifiable vote by mail. So I'd love to have it, we're still working on techniques, but in a vote by mail state, yeah, we need risk limiting audits, and we need good, robust risk limiting audits.
I wonder, just real quick, Les, do you think that some of the challenges that Josh or Matt have discussed are way out there in left field and not possible? You need to be aware that adversaries are arrayed against our systems, our critical systems, critical information systems, who spend all day long figuring out ways to compromise. And so you do have nation states, it's not just the Russians, there's at least 20. And so when Matt was saying that the Iranians, they had to boost the Iranians out and the Chinese out, they'd already caught in. You have to realize that we are targets. If you have something that adversaries own, depending on their resources and time availability, they'll figure a way in.
To amplify the point that Barbara said, when we did the RABA study, one of the team members was an expert lockpick. And he had to pick the lock on the side of the voting machine in order to put in the keyboard to change the votes. It took him exactly 10 seconds to pick the lock, and his body was positioned in such a way that the election officials would not see him. So the people who were playing the election officials really didn't see anything until we started laughing.
Is that person by chance also named Matt?
No.
All right, well, I'd like to open it up to questions.
This isn't a question, it's an endorsement of what Barbara's been saying. I spent 30 years working for the government, the Department of Defense. We had that kind of incursion 20 years ago, 25 years ago, where there were multiple attempts at denial of service every day against our systems. It's nothing new, it's just gotten more sophisticated and more intense. And every security briefing that I've ever been in emphasizes the disgruntled employee is the greatest threat to any system. So it's very, very verifiable. And thank you.
I'd like to just add quickly. Matt talked about denial of service, you're talking about denial of service. Denial of service is worse in elections than any place else I know, because denial of service in other places can slow things down, can stop things for a while. When you're shopping, you have a denial of service, you have to wait till tomorrow to buy the coat, whatever. But let's say, I'll pick your state, California. If you had internet voting, and there was a denial of service attack on the San Francisco area, the Los Angeles area, nowhere else, suddenly a blue state is turned red by a targeted denial of service attack, which is a kind of denial of service attack which we don't know how to address.
And I totally agree with you. Washington State is a big target for a number of reasons. One is a lot of foreign adversaries mistake us for Washington, D.C. It is true. For the folks that know where we are, we have a lot of military in our state. So whether it's Everett, Bremerton, Lewis McCord, there's a lot of military in our state as well. And finally, we are a tech hub, and so there's a little bit of a kind of a feather in their cap. Whether it's Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google have large footprints here now as well. Adobe, you can go on and on and on. So you're absolutely right that we are a target. The state defends millions and millions and millions and millions of attacks every month. I don't actually ask them for too many details. I don't want to know how bad it is, but so just in the last 5 years, the state has set up, and we have a chief security officer as well. And so it is not to diminish at all the severity of these attacks. It has to be put, I think, in our priority list of what kind of elections do we want to have. Do we want to have biometric scans every time we go into the polling place? You're going to scan our retina or something like that? You know, I mean, where does that data live? And it is about access. It is about trying to find the will of the people, trying to find common ground as we move forward on policies, trying to make sure that those decisions are being done publicly. So there's a lot of other pieces that come in, not at all to diminish the real attacks that were under Barbara's administration.
I want to thank you for leveling the conversation, because Matt and Josh and I spend our time in that rarefied atmosphere looking at worst cases because we see it, and it does tend to give us a certain view of life. So, I mean, I appreciate having the balance, but I want to pick up on what Marcy was saying about government has endured these types of attacks for decades. What I think we're seeing is civilians are now being impacted to a greater degree, and it's coming up on their radar screen. And that's not bad, because I can tell you that I have long been concerned about the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure, online and vulnerable. If you're interested in a good read, try Ted Koppel's book that he wrote a couple of years ago called Lights Out. $10 on Amazon. He has a pretty good grasp of the situation as it relates to the electric utility industry. So I think that citizenry is now coming up on the radar screen. The problems are coming up on the radar screen now. That wasn't the case before.
Another question?
I appreciate all your work and talk about the audits and our panelists as well. So that's after the election. I think we also need to be aware of, and I want to know if you're doing any work in this area, pre-voting. We're all on the internet. Some people are on Facebook getting inundated by Russians. And it might be affecting how they end up voting. So are you doing any work looking at that, or are we leaving that to Facebook to figure out how to secure, or what?
The work that I do that's associated with that is, I don't consider that tied to elections. It's so broad. The area I'm looking at is specifically called attribution, is in the ability to associate an entity, person, company, nation, state, whatever, with something. But that is not a primary area that I do research in.
I guess I'll add, there are lots of other serious issues in voting. There's this whole disinformation thing, there's gerrymandering, there's voter access and voter ID laws and all these things. There are many, many things. My own expertise is on the narrow aspect of the accurate casting and counting of votes. Not that these other things are less important, but these are the things that I can speak to.
In the pink?
I want to thank you for this evening. I've really have learned a lot. And since you're the experts, I have to ask this question. I have the feeling that we really do not know who really won the 2016 election. I mean, they keep saying that, but I mean, from what you say, it's like, who knows? Does anybody really know?
So I'm elected. I get elected every 2 years. I'm in my 8th term. I've been on the ballot 9 times. I've been around elections and campaigns for the last 30 years. And at some point, what it comes down to is what happens when the election is certified. And so I say that because it's the Electoral College went for Donald Trump. He's the President of the United States. It's not about the popular vote. That happened the same thing in 2000. We had some shenanigans post-Civil War after Reconstruction. And so when you say who won, we generally agree on who won is the one that takes the office that has the certification. There can be some questions about whether votes are counted properly, whether it's processed properly, and generally speaking, everybody knows the rules going in, and then you sort of fight about how many ballots you can get. And you hope that our election officials are playing it straight. We probably have the most upstanding, good election people that we've ever had in the nation's history. That doesn't mean that they're perfect. Doesn't mean that they're doing everything right. I'm actually tangling with some folks now about rejection rates. And so people that send their ballots in are having them rejected in King County at a rate 10 times higher than other places in the state. So I'm like, why is that happening in King County? Why is rejection rates in King County at 2% and they're at 0.2% Thurston County. So is that cultural? Is there a process there? Why is that different? I mention that because we may not know exactly all the votes that were counted. We know that Clinton won the popular vote, and we know that Trump won the Electoral College. And I'm not a fan of the Electoral College at all. I think we should get rid of it. And I think that the national popular vote, we're going to see sort of more and more polarization around some of our policies around it. So in some ways, after somebody takes office, it kind of doesn't matter whether all the votes were there or not. It should be used as a motivator to get your folks out next time, not as a demotivator, which is a lot of what folks are saying now is, my vote doesn't count, I'm not going to do that anymore. I think that's exactly the wrong way to go. I think that when your person loses, it should make you want to go fight harder
Well, I
in
agree
that process.
with everything you say. I mean, I totally agree with that. But I think from what they've enlightened us with, it sounds like, you know, do we really? You know, there's a little this, a little that, and
Let me
who
try to
knows?
address it quickly. because
It sounds like it's pretty messy.
Yes,
And with the Russians.
Sorry. Yes, we know there was a lot of disinformation, we know there were a lot of
Yeah.
other issues. But directly to your point, I was on a call with election officials from all over the country 2 days after the November 2016 election. And the consensus was that as far as the narrow aspect of vote casting and counting goes, that with rare exceptions, this was the cleanest election that had been seen in a long time. There definitely were some issues, but we really have no evidence of large-scale vote tampering. We know it's possible, but we haven't seen any evidence of it in that election.
I think that's good to hear. Thank you.
I wonder what effect mandatory voting might have on these issues. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Hmm?
I think Australia has
Yes,
mandatory.
there are many countries that do. Yeah.
Well, that's a good question, but I wanted to pick up your concerns a little bit. I don't know how you folks feel about it, but I think that the news media does a disservice to our confidence in the election system because they gloss over the details. And when you think about corrupting an election the way we've discussed it, you have to think about where the boundaries are drawn. And so we've already said that we don't have a monolithic system in any state or nationally that would allow for massive interruption because things are broken up by counties. You folks would know the details far better than I. But it's inconceivable to me that you could have such a mass disruption. Could there be counties? Could there be circumstances like we've discussed and like Matt studied? Absolutely. But overall, I find it really difficult to believe that there was mass interruption. Even the trolling on Facebook, I really have difficulty believing it changed a lot of minds. But you folks can maybe comment.
Okay. So I actually disagree that diversity of our electoral system is a benefit. Excuse me.
You don't think it's a benefit?
I do not think it's a benefit. I think it's a risk. If an attacker had to corrupt and compromise all the systems, then it would be, the diversity would be a benefit. But because an attacker needs to only attack a few systems to steal an election, an attacker can actually pick and choose whichever ones are the easiest, and therefore the diversity is actually an advantage for an attacker, in my view.
In terms of the software being corrupted?
In terms
the
of
system?
any kind
Yes.
of attack, yeah. Maybe should I address your question about mandatory voting? Yes, there are some countries, Australia, New Zealand, Belgium, that have mandatory voting. There are trade-offs, and there are a lot of reports that people who are forced to vote and don't want to do not take it very seriously. I've heard both sides of that. An interesting thing, and maybe you'd find this interesting, I heard a proposal about 10 years ago in the state for a voter initiative that would pay every voter in Washington perhaps $50, some revenue neutral way for voting, so you get a benefit. And given that the people voting on the initiative would be people who vote, this might do quite well. And of course, you can raise taxes to compensate for it. It's an interesting thought. I don't, from what I've seen, it really doesn't change very much. The people who don't want to vote, a lot of things can be tried to raise voter turnout. For the most part, the people who don't vote, with some exceptions, don't want to vote. Unless there's actual voter suppression going on, it's very hard to, once you reach a certain level of accessibility, to raise the participation rate much above that.
In the pink there?
Yeah, thank you all for your perspective. And I take comfort part in what you're saying, that being motivated that if you don't win, to get back out there. I'm probably involved in 25 groups at a certain level. So my question to all of you is, in terms of dealing, in terms of going forward, how do you think average citizens like us, what's our best chance of cleaning up these systems and getting it? I mean, local pressure on the senators. I mean, because we're talking at so many different levels. Help.
These are just giant issues that we're dealing with, right? And so I'll be a little partisan. If there's anything that this president has done for America, it's turning people out. And I think about how I got involved in politics. I volunteered on my first campaign when I was 15 because I was really motivated by something, and so I think people are recognizing that. So these are just huge issues. So how do we get people to care? How do we get whether folks matter or not? One of the things that I'm digging into now is these structural hurdles. Starting last year, we got bipartisan support to put more ballot boxes on the ground. So in 2015, there were 10 ballot boxes in all of King County for 2 million people. And through a competitive race and some funding from the King County Council, they bumped it up 30. And then we got bipartisan support to push ballot boxes out across the state. And we'll probably have 10 times as many ballot boxes in King County alone. There's going to be another 250 across the state. And that happened in sort of an odd, fortuitous way. There's a Republican state senator that got bent out of shape at his county auditor in Snohomish County. He wanted a ballot box in his small town. Kirk Pearson, who's a Trump appointee now, he's out of the state senate. Yes. Sam Hunt and I had been working on that bill for a couple of years and unable to get it through the Republican Senate. And so we had it come from the Republican-controlled Senate to the House, and up and out it went. And so, that's a simple, I think, people know what a ballot box on the ground looks like. And you see them starting to pop up around a little bit. So working at the local level, making these elections where people, these are elected officials, making them accountable. So if there's a screw up, you should throw the bums out. I mean, that's good old American sort of thing. Or have them explain it, or you have a little investigation. But right now, one of the criteria, sort of unwritten criteria to run for election administrator is to be certified in election administration. The only way to become certified in election administration is to work in an elections office for 2 years and then go take the test. So somebody else can't even take the test. They can't even, challenge. And then if you're in some counties and you see some talent coming up, you don't let them get certified, right, if they're going to run against you. And so we need to figure out some of these structural hurdles, right, whether it's a ballot box that people understand or whether it's about the certification process that people don't understand. I can tell you, election officials in our state are allowed to put their name all over the ballot. Hey, here's the voter pamphlet, paid by taxpayers, brought to you by me, I'm running, vote for me. And so a Republican and a Democrat were going to pull that off. So now in Washington State, you can't do that if you're on the ballot. Oh, that's nice. Well, for 3 years you can do it, and 1 year you can't. So we had they start thinking structurally, how do we clean this stuff up? There are these little things that actually start mattering as you start adding them on top of each other. And that's kind of the way I looked at this, at the access package. vote by mail is great, it's got its downsides. And so it bumped turnout, I think it's gonna flatten out. More ballot boxes is not gonna save us, but it's gonna help a little bit. And once we get those on the ground, then prepaid postage might help a little bit, right? King County's been doing some innovative things about that. Having same-day registration changes the demographics on who shows up and who thinks about it. We've got 3 registration deadlines in statute now. Automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration. Proven policies in other states are gonna help us break these hurdles down. And I think that's the way to think about this stuff, is let's have competitive races that have an exchange of ideas, create accountability, and so that, I'm on a certification board right now, there's 4 auditors, the Secretary of State has 2 votes on this board, and I'm like, how did the Secretary of State get 2 votes? And there's legislators, so it's these little structural things, and I'm not poking at any individuals, I can if you want me to, but I'm just saying that there are these structural things that we haven't paid attention to. Nobody paid attention to them very much until we had 2004. We had a bunch of reforms, because wow, that was close. And now we're sort of looking at it again, we've done a bunch of reforms. Let's start looking at the data, let's start having reports, let's start thinking about how we can do things better. I think that, especially on access, accountability, nonpartisan issues, structure, that's often led and done by local officials in either the county council who fund the elections or the elections office.
Thank you for your work.
So, can I quickly add? Just to help focus people, it really helps to give them actual solutions that they can focus on. That helps mobilize people rather than there's something wrong. And I want to take another opportunity to say, in terms of elections, we can try, there's a lot that we can do to try to lock them down, but auditing is really the best thing we can do. And that before I want to turn and thank Representative Hudgens again for the work that he's done on getting auditing up and going, real auditing in the state, but we should keep on pushing him to get auditing everywhere. So that's a good thing to mobilize.
And I would add to your point too about things you can do on the ground level is talk to your county auditor and election officials about risk limiting audits, because that might not be a concept they've heard of before. And there's a lot of stuff online now talking about what they are, how they can be done, and that can be a great conversation to have. Let's take one more question in the half.
So you sold me on the end-to-end verification. One problem that I saw, that it sounds like it kind of goes against what Dr. Bishop was saying, where you can prove who you voted for if you met someone in a coffee shop and showed them with your key and said, like, this is who I voted for, now can I buy that vote afterwards?
No,
that's not
as a voter, I don't have a key. I don't have any way to show anybody else. And I understand this is something that is very hard for people to grasp. But I have no way after I voted to show anybody else how I voted. I walk out, I don't have any keys, the only information I have is the receipt, and the receipt doesn't show how I voted. It shows the equivalent of like a tracking code, where I can track and see that my vote hasn't been changed from the time that I had an opportunity to see what it was. But once I leave the voting polling station, I can no longer show anybody how I voted.
You can't check. Can you?
I can check that. I can check when at the time that I'm voting that this matches, and then I walk away with something that I can check hasn't been changed from the time that I can check how it matches. But I can't show anybody how I voted. So I do have that protection.
Yeah, the whole issue is, can you prove how you voted? And the answer is no. You can simply prove to yourself how you voted, but the whole point of it is you can't show others. So it's perfectly safe.
Barbara wants to make a comment.
Yes, I wanted to bring up the issue of information. Someone mentioned trolling and the impacts of false information going out to voters prior to an election, or the advantages that some candidates have had over others using certain tools like Cambridge Analytica was in the news, there have been others. We didn't talk about that, but I think that has me more concerned in some ways, because the subtle upending of society could really be promoted in that. So I just wondered if people felt the same concerns, if you folks feel the same concerns.
I would,
Yeah, I think that's another 2 to 3 hour forum that we could have.
a very quick comment, Barbara. I disagree with your subtle.
It's not subtle.
No.
Is it observable? Are people recognizing?
All right, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up here. So just what we're hearing on the national front from cybersecurity experts and with the state of current technology that we have and with monetary concerns, one of the best defenses against errors, fraud, tampering, and interference is paper ballots. And with Washington State, we're fairly close to being almost 100% paper ballots, falling short with that email ballot return. And then to check the paper with robust, statistically based post-election audits such as risk limiting audits. This allows elections to have the ability to recover regardless of attack, and ultimately it gives voters the confidence that the election outcome is correct. In a democracy, citizens must have faith that their votes count and is counted correctly. Every vote must count and every vote must be counted as cast. And so I'd like to thank Professor Bishop and all of our panelists for sharing their expertise with us tonight. So please join me. I'd like to extend thanks to the League of Women Voters of Seattle-King County, in particular Stephanie Sirkovich and Allison Fair. If you're here, could you stand up?
She got lost. If I may just say, Black Griffith is on the board of Seattle-King County. The president got stuck in traffic.
And again, thank you to the UW Center for Information Assurance and Cybersecurity and Morgan Zentua. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Thank you, Morgan. And Kathy Sakahara, she is the advocacy lead for election issues. And this event could not have happened with all of their time, without all of their time and energy. So if you're interested in learning more about the League or the Center for Information Assurance and Cybersecurity, there is stuff on the back tables on the way out. You can register to vote. You can update your address if you've moved recently. And just remember, voting is the most powerful statement anyone can make. And if we don't vote, then those who are attempting to disrupt our elections will have accomplished a large part of their objective. So thanks for joining us tonight.